Hello, this is Southend TV. My name is Tracy Chapman and I'm talking to the prospective parliamentary candidates for the forthcoming election on the 8th of June. And today we have James Duddridge with us. Nice to meet you, James.
Good to be here. Thank you very much, Tracy.
Perhaps you could just tell us a little bit about yourself and how long you've represented Southend.
So I've been the Member of Parliament since 2005. Obviously there are no members of Parliament now since Theresa May went to the Queen and dissolved Parliament, but I've been involved in politics for over 25 years now, but most recently as the Member of Parliament for Rochford and Southend East over the last 12 years.
And what is your connection with Southend? Do you live in Southend?
I live in Thorpe Bay, in the middle of Southend, and I've lived here since 2004. I first came to Essex when I was 18 and I went to the University of Essex. So, like a lot of people, not born and bred here, but new to the town.
Well, lovely to have you in Rochford and Southend East. It's very difficult for you at the moment because the manifestos for the main parties haven't been published. Mm-hmm. Are there any personal ambitions that you would have for Rochford and Southend East that you would like to share with us?
Many ambitions. Firstly, we've been very successful with the airport. Perhaps over the last 12 years, the airport has been the biggest thing that's helped regenerate the area. The university in the middle of the town centre has helped keep the high street vital. So I think there's a real importance locally to keep the economy growing. And to do that, we need to make sure that we deliver Brexit, we move on from Brexit and deliver a strong and growing economy to take forward those areas, but particularly that regeneration. I'm very proud to have helped the airport not originate, because there was the one flight to Cologne many years ago, but basically help set up the airport, but also to get the funding, the 23 million that's going to be the business park alongside the airport, which will generate hundreds, if not thousands, of jobs over the short to medium term and over 5,000 in the longer term.
It will generate a lot of jobs, and people are saying anywhere up to 7,000 jobs. Where do you think all of those people that will be working at the airport will live?
Well, there's a number of developments nearby. It's important that we get the right traffic infrastructure along the A127. Ironically, some of the improvements that the government have already funded, we're seeing at the moment, but not the benefits of, because as the work happens, it is worse to get in and out of Southend. Perhaps the biggest challenge for Southend, and to a lesser degree Rochford and the north of the constituency, is the access times in and out. I mean, a third crossing will undoubtedly help us alongside the Dartford Tunnel and Bridge. The improved C2C line is fabulous. So, depending on where you live, an hour and 10 minutes to 45 minutes from Southend into London. I think we need to reduce that a lot more. I would like all trains below 59 minutes during the consultation on the train timetables, which was a bit of a chaotic disaster and didn't work. But one of the things they did do on phase 2 was put in 1 or 2 trains at under 49 minutes, and I think that will be very symbolic for the area. When people look to relocate, they're looking for places of high quality for education, high quality in terms of how they live, what resources we've got, but also the speed to get in and out of London. And I think getting everything down below an hour will be absolutely vital. But of course the airport, there's the issue of getting to the airport and the additional traffic. But of course, if we've got the airport up and working, if we've got those 2 railway lines going into London improving, and on a Bellier line we're getting new stock in, certainly well before 2020 in entirety, there will be new refurbished trains. That improves the infrastructure, and you don't need to go out to Gatwick or Stansted. You can fly from Southend, and increasingly I think people will be choosing to use public transport.
Well, everyone hopes that people choose to use public transport, but there are issues around public transport, the bus routes, and moving along between different parts of Southend can be difficult. Once you're in Southend, you can't get about. But I'd like to move on to schools. Mm-hmm. And we know there are some issues around school funding, mm-hmm. and I wondered what you, as a local Member of Parliament, if you're lucky enough this time, what you will do to address some of those issues.
Mm-hmm. Well, in the past, the funding of local schools has been relatively good. I would argue under the Labour government there was too much of a a propensity to fund buildings rather than invest in teaching across all the age ranges, although there was some very good work in the early years provisioning. The government quite rightly are looking at funding again across the board. They came up with a consultation of how to fund schools in a fairer way. That was a consultation, it's not a diktat, it's not something that's going to happen. But that would have left our schools in a pretty poor state compared to where they were, and as pupil numbers increased as well. I made it very clear I would not support a bill that put through that package, but also made it very clear that it was a consultation. I've met with Justine Greening, I've met with Nick Gibb, who's the Minister of State, a number of times, along with my parliamentary neighbour David Amos. We had a whole debate on Southend education system. And received reassurances both in that debate and outside the debate from ministers. So the plan or the consultation document will not go ahead as is.
And you're providing that reassurance to the people of Southend?
Yeah, absolutely.
Another question I've got for you, with all of those people perhaps moving into Southend to take up those jobs around the airport, where are we going to put more schools? Schools are fairly hard pressed at the moment and children are going all over the place. I wondered how we're going to increase the size of those schools, or if we're going to have to build new schools, where they will be.
Well, there's a new school proposed to the north of Hall Road, and that will serve
And that's
Rochford.
a primary?
I believe so, yes. There's also more funding going into place. So Southend High School for girls had some funding for its sixth form. That's been slightly set to one side because of the Purdah period. Westcliff High School for boys have got additional capital expenditure, and I believe that's maybe even opened in the next few weeks.
And that's
so
an expansion
progress.
of school places, is it?
So that's an expansion of school places and physical expansion of the site. There is a bulge year going through Southend coming up. Been working very closely with the local authority on how to fund that and where to fund that, because one of the issues with academy status is it's the schools, and quite rightly their choice as to whether to expand. How the local authority retains a duty to make sure there's the overall right number of places. So schools like Shoebury High School have been very good in looking at how they can help with those bulge years coming through in the next 2 or 3 years.
And
And
how
there
do you
will be
feel-
funding specifically needed for that.
Good. How do you feel about the number of children that are coming in from outside of the borough to take up places at the Southend grammar schools?
Well, firstly, when we say talk about outside, we need to be very clear. I represent Great Wreckering and Rochford, so
I was
10 years ago
specifically
they would have
thinking
been
wider.
excluded.
Yeah.
There are, if you get onto the C2C line, a lot of people coming in from Thurrock, from East London, places that are an awful long way that we wouldn't consider part of our extended. I think if you're talking about people coming in from Hadley and Benfleet and Wakering and Rochford, you know, they're very much part of the broader Greater Southend community. The government will allow new grammar schools to be built. So firstly, where there is demand and people are coming in, there will be grammar schools potentially in Thurrock that will attract people from that area and to the east of Thurrock, so that will reduce demand. But at the moment, anybody that passes the threshold test in Southend for getting into the grammar schools do get a grammar school place. But it's right that you know, grammar schools are there for the top tier. Remember, in Southend as well, we already look to the top 25% tier rather than places like Kent, where it's much more selective with a kind of a 10% cut off the top. So there are things that are happening that will help, but I would reassure people who have children in the broader Southend area, if a child passes the 11 plus, there are spaces available, and historically they've always got places despite the influx of people coming in from outside. We should be proud of our schools.
Oh, we should be proud of our
They're
schools.
so in demand.
Another question for you, and one that is causing some alarm in the community, is the hospital in the A&E, and I wondered where we stood with that.
Well, there's a lot of rubbish talked about the hospital. Hospital funding is going up. Last year, NHS funding in the area went up a full 4%, well above the rate of inflation. However, there are lots of changes, medical changes in the health service that need a whole review of services. Specifically, I'll talk about A&E because that's, I think, what people are fixating on, but it's probably only about 25-30% of a much broader programme for the NHS. I probably had about 20 to 30 meetings from the Secretary of State to hospital managers to consultants and people at the hospital around these issues. First thing to say is for A&E at the moment, it's slightly counterintuitive. If I was unfortunate enough here in Southend to have a heart attack now, I would be taken to Basildon Hospital because that's where the best care is. I had a problem with my pancreas a few years ago, and I had to be taken to Royal London Hospital, also the type of place you go if you were stabbed or shot. There are other things that we're very proud of. So the stroke unit in Southend is fabulous. However, medical changes mean that rather than getting the clot busting drug as quickly as possible, that's not the way things are going to work in the future. We're going to go to more kinetic surgery and pulling out the clot, and that requires radiologists, anaesthetists on standby constantly. So it makes sense to centralise those types of issues. So at the moment, the proposal is that Southend A&E remains open. It remains open 24/7. It remains open in exactly the same way for people wandering in with a problem. There will be immediate care for those individuals. It is unchanged in terms of ambulances that are ordered by doctors when you go to the doctor's surgery and then come in. However, major trauma care is likely to be centralised in Basildon, which will mean 24/7 there will be that plethora of support network. So it's not just the time to get to the hospital that's important, it's when you get to the hospital to have the full range of staff available to perform whatever complex operation is needed, sometimes at short notice. And because medical process has changed, it's become more complex, more specialised, in order to have all those services you have to serve much greater population area.
But if we do have a little accident in the street, or one of the children has an accident playing sport, we can take them to the A&E at Southend. Yeah. Nothing will stop that.
I have received absolute assurances from the Secretary of State that Southend A&E will remain open and will be a full servicing A&E in relation to people walking in. However, there will be a specialisation across a number of other areas. A slightly different angle on the A&E, probably we would all know people that have had surgery planned at Southend Hospital that's had to be cancelled. Yeah. And that's normally because of the volume and the types of cases going into A&E. By moving the trauma cases to a single unit, it will allow Chelmsford and Southend to specialise in elective planned care, and those type of operations are going to be less disrupted because the major traumas will be taken to a central area than they currently are. So they're very good upsides.
But all of those minor issues you will be able to go into the A&E at Southend to have those dealt with.
100% Councillor, I guarantee.
James, we have to touch on Brexit.
Mm-hmm.
How do you think us leaving the European Union will affect the people of Southend? And we all know that I think it was 60-odd% voted in Rochford and Southend East for leaving the European Union. So there is a passion here for that. Mm-hmm. How do you think that's going to pan out?
It's certainly a clearer cut here, and I campaigned for Brexit. I was a leading member locally of the Vote Leave campaign. Even though I was a government minister, I took the decision that Brexit was right. I was the only minister in the Foreign Office that campaigned for Brexit and promoted Brexit, not only in Southend and Essex and the UK, but around. Who knows? But in terms of Brexit, I think I voted for Brexit because I thought we didn't want to look at an old, tired trading bloc. We wanted to look internationally, to leverage our kind of global influence in countries that speak English, in countries where there's a strong historic connection, as opposed to some of the European countries that we have less of a connection to, particularly some of the smaller European countries. So I voted for Brexit because I think Brexit will be an economic boom. I think linking into a tired, over-regulated federal structure of Europe was always going to go badly wrong. I'm a little pessimistic about the future, to be frank, of the Eurozone, but what we need now is to make sure that we vote to make sure we've got the maximum number of Conservative MPs in the Commons, the maximum number of the popular vote, so we can send Theresa May back into Europe with a fresh mandate to deliver the right Brexit that in turn will deliver a strong economy for the UK. And only the Conservatives can do that.
And how do you see the fishing industry in Lee coping with this? I understand many of the boats are now owned by the Spanish. How will that alter? How will that change? Can you see the boats coming back into British hands?
Well, there's a number of questions. Obviously, the Gilson family I know relatively well, and whilst the vessels are normally outside in David Amos's constituency and had a greater link there, there's obviously the retail side of the business.
Absolutely, it's in your area.
in Southend, and being very closely in touch with them over the years on a number of issues, particularly the dredging, European impacts. Yeah. But I think bringing back greater control of our fishing is absolutely essential. It makes no sense to have kind of put ourselves in this position going forward, and it's not just the fishermen in Lee, it's around the country.
Yeah. But do you see those boats remaining in Spanish hands?
I mean, I'm not aware of the ownership of the vessels that you're specifically talking about. I mean, the main two vessels that I know, and this is slightly outside my patch, so I said first my other parliamentary colleague, are owned by the Gilson family. I was not aware that those had transferred ownership in any way, shape or form.
This is my understanding. It's probably just gossip, but this is what I'm told. James, it's going to be very difficult if we do return Theresa May with a very large majority for MPs to sometimes get, as backbenchers, to get their voices heard. What can you do for Southend using perhaps your links with other members of Parliament to be heard about the issues that we have in Southend here?
Well, I mean, we do work together and hunt on block, as it were, as the Essex Tory group, and it's good that we are one. But actually, one of the things I've found in my 12 years is sometimes the most effective form of lobbying and progression is quiet diplomacy. And there's a need for standing up in the House of Commons or in a committee and running big high-profile campaigns. But when I look back and think about what was successful, actually it's quite often what goes on in the corridors around. And that's the discussions are very much done on the basis of long-term relationship and trust. So an example would be the airport. I know I had a very short conversation, but very important conversation, with one of the Labour ministers at the time, who was actually quite a good minister, and said, look, I want to speak to local MPs about this planning application. And I was able to, in a quite brief time period, tell him what the pros and cons were, what the advantages were to the area, and he changed his mind based on that conversation. And he did that because he was a good minister who talks, he knew me and he trusted me, and I was honest with him about the pros and the cons. And that's quite often how business is done in the House of Commons. I'm always surprised when I thanked occasionally for doing things. They say, oh, it's great that you got involved with X or Y or Z. And you think, I only just passed through and someone took a photo and it happened to appear on social media and a paper or so forth. Actually, most of what MPs do, and the most work, goes totally unseen. So, rather like a swan or an iceberg, you only see what goes on at the top. So there is a necessity to grandstand and organise, and the kind of things that you will see in the national media, the local media, the press, and on Southend TV. But actually, the more effective stuff is done behind closed doors. But it helps that we're a unified group, and as a Conservative, I can go and see Theresa May or grab her in the division lobbies anytime I want. But quite frankly, most of the things we need from Southend are delivered at a junior ministerial level, where the relationship's even more important. And having long-standing members of Parliament who are respected in the Commons means you can deliver more for your constituents.
Thank you, James. Is there anything you'd like to say to the people of Rochford and Southend East?
Well, firstly, make sure you register. Secondly, make sure you vote. This election is quite a simple one in my mind. There's lots of issues people will want to talk about, but in my mind it's about delivering Brexit, moving on and securing our economy, and to do that you need a strong and stable leadership, the leadership of Theresa May, and I would ask people on the day to think of one thing, and one thing only. Who do you want controlling our economy, managing the Brexit process? Do you want Theresa May, or do you want Jeremy Corbyn and an ad hoc coalition of chaos? If people go in with that question in their mind, I think Theresa May will be back in number 10, and we'll be able to start delivering again as we have been over the previous years.
Very nice to meet you, James. Thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you, Theresa. It's been a pleasure.